Um, I had everything planned for last week, but as you probably have found out, I wasn't here last week. As a consequence, everything changed in terms of what I wanted to do. I had planned at the end of the session the last time we were together was to end up with Genesis and get started on this documentary hypothesis. My plan from way back last summer was to get to the documentary hypothesis and then move into Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers and take a look at how the documentary hypothesis applied to those particular chapter books in the Bible as well. But when I was thinking about it, I found out that what we've been doing in the book of Genesis does that a lot better in terms of showing how valuable the documentary hypothesis actually was. So I decided to go back and take a look at Genesis again. We're going to be reviewing a little bit of Genesis, and actually I'm going to put at least one chapter in that you've never seen before, that we've never talked about in this class. But to show you how the Bible was put together is the most remarkable thing you can imagine. When you go through these books rather carefully, you read them, as a lot of people have been doing for many years, they find that this idea of the fact that Moses wrote these first 5 books just doesn't work. Because even though Moses was old, he was not senile. And there were too many times when he would change the story in the middle of a story. And that led people to realize that, hey, maybe what we're looking at in the book, in these books, are various different documents that were put together and made into a single document. Now, I tried to do this. I don't know how successful I was, but tried to read some things from Genesis to show you that there was a story. Actually, what I was doing is trying to point out the fact that there was a certain amount of success in developing this idea of a single story. Yet when it's examined very carefully, it turns out there are different stories that are put together. I'll go very briefly through some of the rudiments of the documentary hypothesis to get to what I really like to talk about here. Hypothesis, we talked about that last week. What a hypothesis is, this is not a law or something. This is just a way that we have of trying to find explanations for things. And the document is anything that's a written document, or it could be a spoken document too. As far as what we have in the Torah, which are the first 5 books, which often are referred to as the books of the law, or the 5 books of what? The 5 books of Moses. It doesn't take too long to realize that Moses did not write these 5 books. But it was a very convenient sort of a thing to say, okay, they came from Moses. What they found in a lot of effort that goes all the way back into the 1700s and finally went to fruition around 1850, 1870, was an idea that there actually were some very fundamental documents that were available that were being used to put together what we have in the Torah or in those 5 books of Moses. These are the documents that they found. There was the Yahwist document, a Yahwist document and an Elohist document. I can mention these two because these got their names because Yahweh is a name for God, and it was used in some of the document used in the document that we call the Yahwist document. Elohist is another name for God. When we get to the story of Moses and the burning bush, I'm going to talk quite a bit about the names of God. I realized there are probably a half a dozen. No, I was wrong. I got one slide that's got 100 different names in which God is designated in the Bible. In addition to the Yahwist and the Elohist, there is called a priestly source, and it is very different from these sources. And it covers about the same material, but in a very different way, and I'll talk about that in a moment. There was a 4th type of document, and that was called the Deuteronomy document. And it applies only to the book of Deuteronomy. Here is a diagram that is well worth getting to understand. J stands for Yahwist, E stands for Elohist. Both of these are documents that tell great Bible stories. They are the best part of Bible history that we have in some way. In many ways, J and E, or the Yahwist, oh, by the way, it's called J because of the German. The Germans don't have a Y, and so they have Yahweh or Jahweh. And so this became known as the Yahweh, or the Yahwist document. They form the JE. These are where we get our Bible stories, the ones that we're familiar with in the book of Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. They are together with the priestly source, which stands by itself, put together and brought into what we call the Torah, the 5 books. In addition, very, very differently, some of JE is used by the Deuteronomists to form the book of Deuteronomy, which also goes in the Torah. We are not going to be paying any attention to this part of this chart at all, but only to this part of this chart. Now, in addition to J and E and P, you notice R. R is what? The redactor, the editor. That is the person that put this all together, took these written documents and made them into a single document. Was he successful? That document has been around for about 2,400 years now, and it's still among the best sellers of all of them. He was very successful. The redactor, I've in my own mind, have said some of these books are, some of the material in J and E is inspired. But when we get to what the redactor does, it's more than inspired. I think it's divinely inspired. I can't imagine the imagination this man had. And I'm going to try to show you some of the evidence of where the redactor's contribution can become so important in making a book like Genesis look like a single book, when it actually is a composite of 4 different books. Now, in addition to that, I want to talk a little bit about the fact that when we take a look at the Bible, we have this tendency of talking about the Pentateuch and the books of Moses, but Deuteronomy does not belong here. Deuteronomy belongs with these 4 books, and actually the much more reasonable division is that we take Deuteronomy and form a heptateuch, a 7-book thing. Because Deuteronomy and Joshua, Judges, and Samuel and Kings are very similar and are very obviously dealing with a single writer or single group of writers. The Pentateuch, but just those first 4 books, and those are the only ones we're going to be talking about at this time. Now, here are the 3 books, 3 documents that show up in the Pentateuch. Just briefly, the Yahwist. We think that was probably written about the time of King Solomon. There's a lot of question about that, but if you recall, Solomon had a court that had a lot of very learned people. And it may very well be that while Solomon was king and was living in all his glory, there was the time to write down the history of what they had as far as the people up to that time. And so we'd like to believe that it was written around 940, right about the time that Solomon was king. And it deals largely with the southern part of the Israelite kingdom, namely with Judah and Benjamin. Largely with Judah. The Elohist source was probably written sometime later. I've changed this date several times too. It probably was written about 100 years or more after the Yahwist. If you go back to the biblical history, you find out that the northern tribes separated from the southern tribes right after Solomon. As far as the northern tribes, the other 12 tribes, the tribes of Israel, what we call Israel, they would adhere very much to what was written in the Yahweh source because they were a part of the kingdom at that time. This is a little bit different. It wasn't too long after they had separated that the Assyrians came on the horizon, and it became rather apparent from the success that the Assyrian Empire was growing, and it was going to gobble up the Northern Empire. It was going to gather up the northern tribes. And one of the theories is that a lot of the people in the north fled down to Judah. They fled down to Judah to avoid the Assyrians, and when they got down to Judah, they found out that the people in Judah had this Yahwist thing. Why don't we write our own history? And so they started writing about their own history, and that's where the Elohist comes along. probably written around 700 or so BC. The northern tribes went into captivity in 722, so it'd be around 750 to 800 BC that this Elohist document was written. And it deals largely with the north. The biggest tribe in the north, the biggest land off, the most influential was Ephraim. And an awful lot of it deals with Ephraim, one of the tribes that is the son of Joseph. The priestly source is very, very different. They do not think that it was written until about the time of the exile, about the time that the Jews had been in exile in Babylon, and maybe was being written while they were in Babylon or shortly after they got out of Babylon, many, many years later. Now, what the priestly source does is rather interesting. It takes what it has in terms of the stories that we have in J and E, takes those great stories and says, all right, those are fine, but that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in priestly things. The priestly source was written by guess whom? The priests that were part of the temple in Jerusalem. And they're going to look at this from the standpoint of how important is the priesthood. They do not go in for any of these stories. They do not think very highly of these stories. As a matter of fact, in the priestly source, you will find everything that is of pertinence in terms of history, but not told in a very interesting fashion. As a matter of fact, they do everything in the priestly source to avoid being too attractive. They don't want it to be readable. They want it to be authoritative. What we find in the priestly source is kind of interesting. A lot of very strange things that I'll be bringing up every once in a while. Mainly, we're going to find things that deal with something that's very pertinent as far as the Israelites were concerned, and that is family matters. There are going to be a lot of genealogies, for example, that show up in the priestly source. And we'll be looking at some of those genealogies. Just lists of names of people, very common thing. There are parts of the priestly source that we don't have in Genesis, but I could read to you from Exodus, and I can guarantee you I would put you to sleep within 30 seconds. It deals with the length of the tassels that are on the fringe of the shawl that's going to be worn by the priest. These are all outlined in the priestly source. I have never heard a sermon preached by any minister dealing with any of these sort of things. The whole book of Leviticus is devoted to all these sort of priestly things. Have you ever heard a sermon preached from Leviticus or a Sunday school lesson taught from Leviticus? Not very often, because it deals largely with church matter. As far as the priestly source was concerned, they thought it was important. There is another thing that's kind of interesting in this regard. The Yahweh source, as I mentioned, deals largely with the people in the south. It deals with Judah and even with Edom. That's this region down in this right here. Notice the tribe of Simeon down here as a part of Judah. That might become pertinent a little bit later. The Yahweh source deals largely with the northern kingdom. And when we deal with people that are from the northern kingdom, that's going to show up as an Elohim source, not as a Yahweh source. What kind of people are these going to be? We're going to find out there are people like Ephraim, who was a son of whom? Joseph. And things dealing with Joseph largely come from the Elohim source. Moving on. One of the real big differences between the Yahweh source and the Elohim source, however, is a thing that's called anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is a strange word. I did not even know how to spell it. I had to look it up. It deals with the idea that God reveals himself. And sometimes he reveals himself, as it says in some parts of the Bible, in his own image, with human qualities, with human characteristics. This is called anthropomorphism, when God looks and behaves like a human. We'll look at a couple of examples in the Yahweh source where we see God, my goodness, he talks, he walks, he's like a human being. What anti-anthropomorphism is just the opposite, and that is that in the Elohim source, the Elohist does not like to have God portrayed as a human being in any way whatsoever. And what we find in the Elohist source, no appearance of God having human characteristics. I took the definition. Origin of myth, right? The priests that were very pertinent in the formation of this priestly source are called the Zetokine Priests. In the next week or so, I'm going to be going into some detailed history of the Jews to understand how significant it is to know how some separations came as far as the Israelites were concerned in terms of their worship. Let me just ask you a question. Have you ever encountered a situation in a religious group where there might be a difference of opinion? Boy, did they ever come up with it in a very big way. And the Zetokine priests are a very significant part of this, and I'll talk about that again another time. The priests were Zetokites, and we'll talk about Zadok. The characteristics of the priestly source include sets of claims that contradict non-priestly passages and therefore uniquely characteristic. There's no sacrifice before the institution. We'll talk about that. I got another one here that's, I think, more pertinent. I think this is a very pertinent slide. The priestly source, I'll just have to, way over half of the material that we have in the book of Genesis comes from the priestly source, not from the Yahwist and Elohist source. Certainly that is true when we get to Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, that the priestly source outweighs the Yahwist and Elohist source by a considerable amount. I think I have a slide. Oh, here it says, P is notable for its repetition of lists, long, unexciting interruptions into narratives, cold, unemotional descriptions, lack of high literary standards. P treats God as a transcendental, etc. God is also unmerciful, applied to. It's different. It's very different. I read one where somebody said you can read everything that is in the Torah that's pertinent in the Torah in one regard by reading the priestly source, but it's like reading dry bones. There's no life to it. The Yahwist and Elohist source do add life to this. Now, let's move on a little bit. Look at it. Approximately 17% of the Pentateuch is Elohist, 18 is the Deuteronomist, then there's the Yahwist. 45% of the books of Moses are all written by the priestly source. Then there's the redactor. He's the one that took these, particularly these three sources, and tried to put them into a single source. As I mentioned to you before, this redactor, this editor, has to be regarded as one of the most divinely inspired people you could possibly imagine. Because not only did he do this, but he seems to have done it rather successfully. He can do things and fixing up these things that you would not believe, except for the fact that he did it and it worked. I will give you an example of the redactor in that regard. Well, I'll tell you right now that I think I have a verse. No, I don't have it there. I'll tell you what, I think I have a slide, but I can't find it. You will find that the redactor will take the stories of the Yahwist and the Elohist and change it within the same chapter. He'll go from one verse and then all of a sudden it'll be the Elohist verse. That's not all. He even does it sometimes within a verse. He will contradict himself within a verse. Now, how in the world did he ever get away with this? And one explanation that I read, I jumped on right away because it seems so very, very plausible. And that is that there were going to be people that were going to read what this redactor had done and trying to put these together. And they're going to say, hey, did our Yahweh source get in there? Or did our Elohist source get in? If they left it out, guess what? Hey, this isn't valid. What he tries to do is to get both of them represented. And if he has to represent them by seeming to contradict each other a little bit, people don't mind that quite as much as being left out completely. You follow me? They'd rather have both of them there. And this is what we find happening every once in a while. And I think I will have a slide to show you that the splitting up of the verses between the Yahwist, between the Elohist and the priestly, and Yahwist is not on that uncommon. Now, what I'm going to do, this is what I was going to do, and this is what I had planned some time ago, is to go through the book of Genesis and take a look at where we do find some of these Yahweh sources, and the Yahweh sources, and the Elohist sources, and look at some of these. And I'm going to color code them. I'm going to color code them as you've seen here. If it's a priestly source, it's going to be black. No change. But if it's a Yahwist, it will be blue. Elohist will be red. And if the redactor gets involved, we're going to make that green. It was awfully hard to find colors on the internet or on my computer that would show these things up clearly, but it shows the colors even though the printing is as clear as we want. We're going to start out by taking a look at the book of Genesis by looking at the first chapter. How many of you know this chapter by heart? What is the first chapter? It is called the Genesis 1 creation story, or the priestly the priestly creation story. It is the stuff that we have in chapter 1 that you all are familiar with about how God created. Well, let's take a look at a couple slides. Well, before I look at that, I want to point out something else, and that is that it is one of the newest books that we have in the book of Genesis or in the Old Testament. It probably was written about the time that the Jews were in exile, around 500 BC. Most of the other stuff comes from material that was way before that. The only book in the Old Testament that we know would be older than this first chapter that we have in Genesis are things that are in the book of Daniel. Daniel is a very different book, and it probably wasn't written until about 150 BC, during the time of the Maccabees. It is different also from the rest of the Old Testament. But this priestly source that we have is quite interesting. And again, let me remind you of something. How many of you have memorized the first verse of chapter 1 in the beginning? But I want you to notice something. In the beginning, God created the heavens and what else? And the earth. And what we find is that in this priestly source, that's exactly the way it's described in terms of the creation of the things that are in the heaven and here on earth. Is there more than just the earth as far as the cosmos or the universe is concerned? Yes, absolutely. But the way the priestly source is written, he's going to describe what happened in terms of what occurred here on earth. And if we take a look at this, we find that there are some things that are uncanny. First day, there was light. The second day, there was a separation of light from the mass. The third day, guess what? Life appears where? On earth. He's not talking about somewhere else. He's talking about on earth, life appeared. The fourth day, the sun and the moon appeared. Well, I should say, I said correctly, they appeared. Were they there before? Yes, but if you were here on earth and observing the creation, would you have seen the light, would you have seen the sun and the moon and the stars? Not right away. It would have taken literally thousands of years for that cloud cover to disperse. In the meantime, enough light could get through to give rise to plant life. This fourth day is kind of a mystery to some people until you take this idea that it is very possible that an observer here on earth, if he could watch this whole creation process from the very beginning, would probably never see the sun or the moon or the stars for literally eons because of the cloud cover. What went through my mind at that time is that when I was on this sabbatical at the University of Washington in Seattle, I wondered about some of the children in the city of Seattle, if they've ever seen the sun, the moon, and the stars. could very easily go for a long time without ever seeing any evidence. In that regard, that makes some pretty good sense. In terms of the days, the next day we have life. But what's the life? It's very carefully stated that it was the bird life and the sea life. And it wasn't until the sixth day that mammals or land animals actually came on the scene. And what else? And man. And man wasn't there until the sixth day. I just included this. Does anybody recognize that? Michelangelo's creation of man. Let me tell you something. This was written in Babylon. Is it possible that the people in Babylon might have influenced the Jews that were living there? Do you know what happened when the Jews were allowed to go home? A lot of them didn't want to go. They stayed there in Babylon. They were very happy to live there in Babylon. Is it possible that the Jews that were in Babylon, might have been influenced by the society they were living in, by the culture and the religion? Well, it turns out the Babylonian religion at that time was based largely on an epic poem. Remember I mentioned something about an epic poem. An epic poem called the Luma Elish. And what the epic poem does is it talks about the creation of the cosmos, the creation of the earth, and probably dates way back to the time of the Sumerians, about 3000 BC. The form that we have it in is a little bit different. It probably didn't come about until maybe around 1700 BC, which is still hundreds and hundreds of years before the book of Genesis 1, or Genesis 1 was ever written. What I'm going to do is go back to this whole situation of Genesis 1 and the Luma Elish and have a whole lesson just on it alone, because there are so many very fascinating things that arise when we take a look at the similarity between this Babylonian idea and the Jewish idea. One of the things that stands out rather quickly is that the difference between the Luma Elish and Genesis, the Luma Elish, runs 900 lines. Genesis 1 is very short, it's one chapter and that's all. 900 lines. Another thing that's very interesting is that there are periods in the Luma Elish that are interesting, and the periods all are centered around how the gods that existed as far as the Sumerians were concerned had various conflicts, and various conflicts were solved during different periods of that 7-period time. In that I'll tell you one thing. Guess what happened in the 4th period in the Luma Elish? They saw the sun and the moon and the stars for the first time. Where did the priestly writer get this idea? Very likely from the Luma Elish. The other difference is that the Luma Elish deals with these gods that were worshipped by the Babylonians and worshipped by a lot of other people. What the priestly writers did is, we're going to take this very same idea, and we're to look at this thing in terms of the God, of God being the only God that created everything that we have in the creation. And that's exactly what Genesis 1 does. It looks at the whole creation in terms of God being behind it, not between the fights between these different gods. I got to have another swig of water here. If we look at the Luma Elish, we find out that it has a history that goes way back to Sumer. I mentioned that. Hammurabi plays a rather important role. Hammurabi appears on that scene around 1700 BC, and it turns out that the main god that is shown in the Luma Elish is the god of Hammurabi, Marduk. It's the god of Marduk, and so we think that what we're looking at, the Luma Elish, is an epic poem that dates back to about 1700. The reason we find it is that it was discovered by the archaeologists, namely later, we're in the ruins of Nineveh in the Azure Maniple Library. The whole history of how we got this thing is fantastic in itself. And then I will go again as to what I just briefly did, point out the similarities between Genesis 1 and what we have in the Luma Elish. But what I also want to do is to look at some of the things that we have in Genesis 1 that are what you might say are unique to Genesis 1. They may appear in the Luma Elish, but they are kind of different as far as we look at them today. In what regard? Well, one of them, as I already mentioned, the creation is related to us in terms of an observer being here on earth and watching what had happened. This allows us to explain some of the things that we see, such as the sun and the moon appearing on the fourth day. It also gets us into something else, and that is the fact that when we take a look at the way in which life evolved on this planet, what do the evolutionists say today? It's exactly the same. What do the zoologists tell us? This is the way life developed. Somehow, way back at the time of the Luma Elish, there were people that recognized that life came on this planet in a very different sort of a way, with plants, and then later on came the fish and the sea animals, then the mammals, and then man was the last. Same sort of order, no different at all. There is another thing that's quite interesting. I'm not going to put anything on the screen at this time. I'm going to just say it out loud. What is pleasant on the first day? And there was light. Now, on the first day in the book of Genesis, in Genesis 1, it says, and then there was darkness, or day and night. Did the light disappear when it got dark to the observer that was on the earth? No, the light was still there. The light was always there. The light was, well, what is light? Well, if you had to describe light, wouldn't you say it's a form of what? Energy. It is energy. Apparently, on the first day, all we had was energy. Now, I'll go into this more, I'll say something carefully here. What happens on the second day? All of a sudden, we find out land and things start to appear. The planets start to appear. The land starts to appear. How many of you ever heard this mathematical equation, E equals mc squared? Everybody is familiar. What does that mean? Energy is equal to mass times the velocity of light squared. Mass. A relationship between mass and energy is expressed in that equation. Who gave us that equation, by the way? Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein came from one of his theories of relativity, that there was a relationship between mass and energy. Where does this relationship show up in the creation story? On the second day, where there is that separation. There's always been a puzzle. Why did this happen? How many of you have heard of the, I want to get this right, LHC. What is LHC? I had to look it up. Large Hadron Collider. Where is the Large Hadron Collider? In Bern, Switzerland. They have this great big collider that I think it's 14 miles in circumference, where we're allowing protons to smash into each other and looking what comes from those protons. In 2012, there were headlines in a lot of the newspapers throughout the world in that collider experiment, they think they have found a particle that they refer to as the God particle, which may be responsible for the fact that energy can be transformed into mass. Folks, this is showing already in the first chapter of Genesis that there was an evolution that occurred. Now, I'm not going to go any further into it than that. The reason being is that if I talked about this, I'd give the impression that I knew what I was talking about. And I don't know. I don't understand certain aspects of relativity and how this came about. But it's a rather interesting thing. The man that proposed that there had to be a relationship between, I'm getting too far into it. I shouldn't, sorry about that. Anyway, that's going to be a future lesson. Let's go to the next slide. Genesis 2. What do you see here? The first signs of color coding. Now, a lot of people don't realize this, but what did God do on the seventh day in Genesis 1? He wasn't there. It isn't until we get to Genesis 2 that we read, again, priestly, thus the heavens and the earth were formed and all of them, and on the seventh day God finished his work. He rested on the seventh. The Sabbath does not show up until the second what? The second chapter. It doesn't show up in the first chapter. It is still a part of the priestly sword. But here is something else. Green. This is something that the redactor put in. He wants to go from the fact that we have the things that we have in the creation and God resting on the seventh day. He wants to get into the story of what happened to man. In that day the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, and when no plant on the earth was yet on the earth, and no herbs of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no man to fill the ground. Well, nothing had happened. As a matter of fact, when we get to the second chapter of Genesis, I got to learn to stay closer to this thing. But there was no man to continue anything. But a mist went forth up from the earth and watered the whole face of the earth, and the Lord formed man from dust in the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. This is the second creation story. This is the Genesis 2 creation story. The difference between the chapter 1 is that man does not show on the scene until the end of the sixth day. In this one, man shows up first. Then we'll find as we go through Genesis 2 that we find the story of the Garden of Eden, where we'll find the story of the Garden of Eden where man names all the animals and things like that. And finally, on the last part of Genesis 2, what is created for man out of one of his ribs? Then a wife is given to him, and then Eve shows up. The second creation story is very different from the first creation story. Keep them apart. One is a story, one is a very interesting revelation. That's Genesis 2, the second creation story. But the story of Adam and Eve doesn't come until we get to chapter 3. Now the serpent was more subtle than all the other. Well, I don't have to go. You know that story. Everybody here is familiar with the story of how the serpent had beguiled. This is one of my favorite pictures that I have of Bible pictures, because it shows Adam and Eve in the garden with the serpent. You notice anything interesting about the serpent? What has he got? Feet. He's still on his feet. When we go through this story that we have of Adam and Eve, one of the curses that's made on the serpent is that he will no longer be able to walk, but he will crawl on his belly. And here's a picture that shows that. I wish it were a little clearer. The face and expression of the serpent here, if you pardon me, but he looks to me like a used car salesman. There's evil in his eyes. But that's where the story of Genesis. This happens to be a Yahweh story again. Genesis 4 gives us a story of Cain and Abel. In the story of Cain and Abel, well, it points out that Cain was a tiller of the fields, Abel was a herdsman. The next picture shows a picture of Cain with the fields and Abel with the sheep. Do you remember last week we talked about the fact that the Egyptians didn't mind the Israelites going into Goshen because the Israelites were what? Shepherds, and they were not shepherds. And so this idea of a separation of the people that were herdsmen from the people that were tillers of the soil apparently dates way, way back, and is included in one of these early chapters that we have in the book of Genesis. Now, we never talked about that in Sunday school before, but this is kind of an interesting way of looking at what is happening here in terms of a creation, which man and Adam and Eve in the fall in the garden, the fall of Adam and Eve, in the story of Garden of Eden, and then Cain and Abel, and then what happens with Cain and Abel. We get the first murder, the murder of Abel by Cain, and then we get to chapter 5. What do you notice about that chapter? It's colored. It's colored. It is something that the redactor put in. And again, this is something that a lot of people will tell you it says this in the Bible, but they have probably never read it. I'm being a little bit sarcastic here. But do you remember reading or having read to you all the people that succeeded Cain and Abel, and the fact that they lived to such long years? Like Methuselah actually lived to be 969 years. And we take a look at all these other people. Look at here I put Methuselah in there. All of them lived hundreds of years old. This was something that was introduced by the redactor. Where did he get this from? He got this from a manuscript, a document that he had. It's called the Generations of Man. Somebody had put these sort of things together, these generations of man, and he simply copies these generations of man. Among the generations of man, he also talks about a person called Enoch. And Enoch was part of the generations of man, but Enoch was also known for another thing, and what was that? It says in the book of Genesis that he did not die, but was taken up into heaven. Now, I'm getting a little bit off the track, but it's something I just watched the other day on television. When they came across the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s, among the documents they found were a lot of the evidences of the books that we have in the Old Testament, including a book that was not included in the Old Testament. That's the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch is not in the Old Testament. Enoch, the person, is in the Old Testament, but Enoch, the book, is not in the Old Testament. One of the reasons is that it did not fit at the time that they were canonizing the Old Testament with the rest of the Old Testament. Because of this fact that Enoch was taken up into the heavens. Actually, somebody else was taken up into the heavens. Does anybody remember? Elijah. And they both went there the same way on a fiery chariot. Now, what was this fiery chariot? I'm only speculating what others are speculating. Is there anything that you can think of that can leave the earth as a fiery chariot and go somewhere else? Space travel. There may have been space travelers. There may have been people here. Otherwise, how do we explain Enoch and Elijah? But at the time that there was a canonization of the Old Testament, that did not fit with the rest of the Old Testament in the way that there was a relationship that existed between the Israelites and their God. Again, I'll let talk about that another time. Genesis 6 starts out a little bit differently. It again is a part of the Yahwist, and apparently it was a part of the traditional stories that were told that people listened to that were very significant in their lives that talked about the Nephilim. When man began to multiply on the face of the ground and the daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters were fair, and they took them as wives, and they had children. The children are called the Nephilim. This is the only place it shows up, is in this chapter 6, the Nephilim. And it shows up as a Yahwist story. And who were the Nephilim? The only thing that we can say is that they were the giants. Here is a person. Here is somebody that is the Nephilim. Do we know anything more about it? No. Other than the fact that archaeologists have shown us that throughout the Mediterranean area and through other parts of the world, they every once in a while come across skeletons that are unusually large, indicating that at one time there were people that we consider as Homo sapiens that were very large. These were the Nephilim. These were a part of the of the oral traditions that were significant as far as the Jews were concerned. I want to ask you this question. When the people in that period, before the writing of the Yahwehs and all this, before any of these things were written down, how did they find out about these things? Well, in the evening, when they sat around in the tent, in the campfire, they didn't turn on the TV for an obvious reason. There wasn't one. As a matter of fact, they couldn't read because they didn't have anything to read. So what did they do? They told stories. And in this way, some of these stories were repeated over and over and over again. How many of you can answer this question honestly? Have you ever heard of the story of the three bears and Goldilocks? Have you ever heard it more than once? As a matter of fact, when you were a kid, as your kids have probably done, when they ask for a story, which one do they want to hear? Three bears and they don't mind hearing it over and over again. And very likely, a lot of these things that we're looking at right now were parts of the oral tradition that were a part of the people at that time that they heard over and over again. And then, about the time of King Solomon, when the Yahweh's thing was being written, hey, let's put these stories in here at this time. Let's put these stories that have been a part of our oral tradition for so many years. We don't have any written documentation, but we got this oral tradition. Let's include the stories of Adam and Eve, the story of the Garden of Eden, the story of Adam and Eve in the fall, the story of Cain and Abel, the generations of man, we don't know who wrote them. Then we get the story of the Nephilim, and then we get to another story. Well, what happens next? In that same chapter, we find that God was disappointed with what was happening and decided to destroy all life on this planet to get rid of it, with the exception of what? Noah and his family. And then in chapter 6, we start to get the story of Noah, how he was called to build an ark. To build an ark to do what? To preserve some of the life that was on this planet. This again is a Yahweh story. It's a blue story. Once the ark was built, what was he to do? Well, he was to bring animals onto the ark. If I read this carefully, it reads in a very interesting fashion. Then the Lord said to Noah, go into the, I can't read that, go your heart, and take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and the male and his female, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, male and his mate. And 7 pairs of birds of the air, male and female, etc., etc. And for 7 days he will send rain. In that same chapter, on that very same day, oh, by the way, have you noticed something? What color is that? Blue. What color is it? Now, where do we, and there it's black. All of a sudden, we're going to look at the story of Noah. This is one story in chapter 6. All of a sudden, it switches. And what do we read? In that same day, Noah brought it. They went into the ark. How? 2 by 2. Not 6 pairs of clean, but only 2 by 2. Now I go back to this other slide here. We see what apparently was written by the Yahweh's writer. We have more than 1 pair of sheep here, but you'll notice that we only have 1 pair of leopards, and I think only 1 pair of lions and lionesses. They were not clean animals. These were clean animals. What is the difference? Well, the difference comes in a little bit later on in the story. And that is, after the flood, what happens is that Noah does what? He makes a sacrifice to God. He makes a sacrifice to God. He sacrifices an animal to God. What kind of an animal has to be used for a sacrifice? A clean animal. What the Yahweh makes certain of is that clean animals are brought on the ark so that Noah can sacrifice a clean animal as is prescribed. Here's one of the pictures of the sacrifice. I have another picture I think it also shows the fact there are a lot of animals around here, but some animals are being sacrificed. But if we follow the priestly document, could there have been a sacrifice? No, there could not have been a sacrifice. Who wrote the priestly document? The priests. The priests wrote the priest. I'm running out of time, but I'm going to get through this. What the priests are very adamant about is that if you go into the Bible and read what it says, the only people that may make sacrifices to God are ordained priests that are descendants of Aaron. Well, Aaron doesn't come on the scene for another, 10,000 years. There couldn't have been, as far as the priestly document is concerned, concerning the flood, there cannot be a sacrifice. There cannot be a sacrifice. So that there we find, right in that book of Genesis in chapter 6, there's this two stories unfolding. Actually, it was this sacrifice thing that was a very important clue as to what the documentary hypothesis became, recognizing we had to have different sources of looking at these sorts of things. What comes next? I want to get a little bit further. Genesis 11, we get another story. Another story is the story of Tower of Babel. Again, you'll notice that it's blue. It's Yahweh's. Only the Yahweh's write this one. And in that story, they talk about the fact that they were going to build this tower. And, well, we all know that story. And what happened? There was a change in language. And the book of Genesis continues on in an interesting fashion. The rest of Genesis 11, what happens now? It's green. Now, do you remember when we were talking about the fact that Terah, the father of Abraham, was going to move from Mesopotamia, that there was a period of time between the Tower of Babel and the period of Terah, a period of about 10,000 years, in which our Bible says nothing except what we have here in the green. Meaning what? This was put in by the redactor. What the redactor had done is taken these generations and then these are all the people that descended from Shem all the way up to the time of Terah. And then the story begins very differently. From there on in, the story of Genesis deals with Terah and Abraham, his son, and his family, and what happened from there on in. A thing that I came across that I'm going to look into a little bit further, with a little bit of time I got left, is something that I was kind of surprised when I read. A lot of what I'm getting from a book by a guy named Richard Friedman, who was a Bible scholar. He was a scholar, he was a student under Franklin Cross, who was one of the real pioneers in biblical scholarship at Harvard. And what Friedman says here, I said, I didn't read that right. Did I read that right? The things that we just looked at concerning the second day creation, Garden of Eden, table and fall, Cain and Abel, the generations of men, are all following where? In chronological order. In chronological order. What Friedman maintains that this is one of the first times that anybody writing history tried to put things into chronological order. I could not believe that. This would have been about 500 BC. I immediately started to look into this to see what I could find. Certainly, there were historians before the historian or the redactor or whoever put this together. There are certainly historians. Did they not follow chronological order? Who would be the first place you'd go to look for that? I went to Herodotus. Herodotus, the great Greek scholar, and tried to find out, did he pay attention to chronology? I'll tell you what an interesting thing to do on the internet is to try to find out when something didn't happen. Now you can find out when things did happen, but to find any evidence that Herodotus did not follow chronological order, there's little evidence that he did not really show up until one of Herodotus' latest epics, one on the Greek warfare. It can very well be that up until the time, the priestly writer was putting these stories together in this fashion was the first time that we were looking at history in terms of the order in which it came. You say, wait a minute, we all do that. Yes, that's a fetish, but it may have been a fetish that's only been developed in the last 2,400 years, that we have to have it this way because we won't look at it. Can you imagine what history might have been like without doing that? You could take history and take this story with this story. I got a feeling that if you go to I'll say it right now, you go to the Odysseus or the Ulysses story, there are stories that, but don't necessarily follow an order. They're just stories, and you just put them wherever you want. Imagine trying to teach American history to students today and not have it in chronological order. We'll start out with your history book. We'll talk a little bit about the Spanish-American War, and then we'll talk about the Pilgrims in the next chapter. And then another chapter we'll have one on the Civil War, and jump all over without having it in order. And it could very well be that the Old Testament, as Freeman points out, might have been a pioneer in developing this idea that when we want to look at history, we got to look at it chronologically. I have now gone through approximately 1/10 of what I wanted to get through today. And that's the end of our period. Next time I'm going to show you a lot of things in the book of Genesis where we find that this redactor is doing some things that I would say are divinely inspired, that make the whole thing look as a unit story and still keep every one of those sources used and make all the people that wrote those sources say, we are included, and they're all there. The end.
Thank you.